Hello and welcome to episode 3 of the Cougar Prowl podcast. This is Greg Woods, WSU beat writer for the Spokesman Review, joined by CougFan.com's Jamey Vinnick. And Jamey, how you feeling?
Feeling good. How about you, Greg?
I am not bad. We are a few days removed from the Cougs win over San Diego State. That was a 36-13 decision, so they moved to 2-0 on the season. And coming up, they have tough road test at North Texas. I think game time temperatures are going to be in the mid 90s. So, and then you add a few, ticks to that based off of the turf adding a few. So not an easy road going forward, but they are off to a 2-0 start to the season. And we are here to talk about it all. First, we're going to get to the last game, their win over SDSU. Second start of his career, Jackson Potter goes 28 of 42 passing, 257 yards and 3 touchdowns. Again, no sacks and no interceptions. Big reason why he won the starting job during fall camp. And Cougs defense gets done again, holds them to just the 13 points. Opening drive touchdown. That was partially because one of their safeties fell over in coverage. But besides that, they look great on defense for the second week in a row. And we're here to talk about it all. Jamey, give me some of your overall impressions from that one on Saturday.
Yeah, I think when they come out and Washington State goes 3 and out, give up a touchdown, and they go 3 and out again, you're kind of thinking, okay, this looks like a lot of what we saw against Idaho. That they're going to struggle to move the ball, and San Diego State theoretically on paper was a tougher offense than Idaho, especially when they scored. I don't want to say with ease, but as you said, Deron Goodman falls down. They get a 35-yard touchdown. You felt like, okay, this could become a problem. I started going through my head thinking, man, this could end up being ugly. But then they settled in. The defense got to stop. I think, honestly, the kick-catch interference in the first quarter on San Diego State, suddenly you end up with the ball all the way out near midfield, and then that kind of gets the touchdown drive going, and the big play to Carter Papps, the freshman. The first half wasn't great offensively, really up until the end when they get the safety from Isaac Terrell. You get the late touchdown to Trey Lechner, and suddenly you go into half, you're up 19-7. And from there, I think even as the offense maybe stalled a little bit again in the third quarter, stalled a little bit again midway through the third quarter and then into the fourth quarter, you felt pretty good just because it just didn't feel like the defense was going to give much.
And we were talking about this before we hit record. That, in our mind, that is like one of the more noticeable differences between last year's WSU team and this year's WSU team, is that when the offense has these lulls, which last year's team had in their own ways, we feel much differently about how the game is going to turn out this year than we did last year, just because of how improved of a defensive unit the Cougs have this year. And we should know, before we get too much into the defense, they're going to get Cale Reeder back next week, who was veteran safety, played 4 years at South Dakota State, and they're going to get him back this coming Saturday. So their defense is going to get another reinforcement there. So, I mean, they could be even better than they were on Saturday. But that is kind of the reason why we feel more confident in just their ability to get things done when their offense is going through walls. Like, you have trust in the depth at the defensive line. You obviously have trust in their safety core with Tucker Large and Matt Durant. Even with Tucker Large being out for a handful of snaps on Saturday with an injury, he ended up being okay. He went back out there, but that's just kind of the product you get when you have a deep defensive line, pretty deep safety group, even with Reeder out for the first 2 games. So I think that changes like the complexion and kind of the dynamics of these games. Is that you have a lot of new pieces on offense. You have Devin Ellison, who is not going to be playing for each of the first 3 games. You have a new quarterback. You have all types of new players, new running backs. 3 new offensive linemen, and so you are not surprised when they struggle at times, which they did, and we'll talk about that later on. But I think that's like the biggest difference, is that you have all these new pieces. It's not going to be pretty, and it has not been in many instances. But when you have all this depth on defense, like that changes the way the game feels. And I think with Jimmy Rogers and Jesse Boppa, their defensive coordinator, it changes the way I think you approach the game.
No, absolutely. And I think just having some of the depth you have back there, too. I mean, you mentioned they haven't had Reeder. So what's kind of been the solution? Well, then you lose Tucker Large for part of the second half. I mean, ultimately, I think he's fine. There isn't any indication that he won't be available this week. He did come back in after he kind of got shaken up, made a play on fourth down. But so what's the solution? Kyle Peterson plays 40 snaps and looks very good doing so. I think Anthony Polano got a little bit banged up there in the second half. You bring in Jack Ellison, a second-year walk-on freshman. He plays 26 snaps, has a tackle for loss. So I think when you kind of look at what has made the defense successful so far, it's that they are capable of playing a lot of guys. 25 guys played on Saturday. And the only two games, 49 total if you include offense and defense, the only two games last year where guys played more were Portland State and Hawaii. And those were both blowouts. This wasn't necessarily a blowout. I know what the score says. But this was a game where, San Diego State had the ball, I want to say in the third quarter, with a chance to cut it to a one-score game in the fourth quarter. Wazoo goes 3 and out. San Diego State gets the ball at the Wazoo 40, down 13 points, and then the Cougars are able to shut down defensively. And again, a lot of that is some of the depth coming through. And then once the Aztecs made it a 13-point game, they never got back inside into the red zone. The furthest they got was to the Wazoo 37. Through the rest of the game. So there's a lot to like, I think, with how the defense played and just how many guys they can go to and get results.
And this was not an easy offensive line to go up against. The Aztecs offensive line has, they did have over 100 games played between those top 5 guys. So nothing to sneeze at in terms of the competition that they went up against last week. So they feel good about that. I think we should also, just because of how awesome an offensive line that they went up against, talk a little bit just about like the pass rush and just like the way they were able to penetrate the line of scrimmage. Like, we got to talk about Isaac Terrell, which you mentioned earlier. 1.5 sacks, which were his first sacks of his career. One for the safety, obviously, that gets them going toward the end of the first half. Buda Paletti had the other half sack with Terrell, and then Max Balloon in the fourth quarter gets through for his own sack. So all told, three sacks, 7 tackles for loss. I felt like even when they weren't getting home, like that changed a lot of the game, just in terms of their ability to, penetrate the offensive line, and they didn't always have to bring extra guys. I think that's where you saw some of the impact of Max Balloon and guys like that. Like, hey, you don't always have to bring extra pressure to get the quarterbacks, and that in turn, you're already talking about a really strong safety group and linebacker group, deep, linebacker group. But when you feel less obligated to bring some of those guys into the pass rush, somehow that defense gets even better. Did you get that sense at all? Again, what was your sense of that?
Yeah, I think the defense just kind of leaned on San Diego State. I think there were some pressures early on. I wish PFF would let you split up and see when a lot of the pressures came, but it felt like as the game went on, the defensive line just kept coming and coming and coming, and eventually San Diego State's offensive line, wasn't able to hold up. 2 of the 3 sacks in the game coming in the fourth quarter. I know there were a number of tackles for loss. San Diego State in the fourth quarter had a yard. That's it. So we just talked about.
Is that right?
1 yard. They had negative 16 rushing yards. They had 17 passing yards.
Wow.
So we talked about how, they get the ball back on the Cougar 40 down 13 points. So there were opportunities, and they had a yard. And obviously a couple sacks played into that. But, I think what you saw from the defensive line now, consecutive games, 16 pressures. And, it's kind of, you don't have to get the sack to impact the play. Now, the sack is better, as we saw, the fourth down sack, the turnover on downs, the safety, Max Balloon sack, I feel like in the fourth quarter really kind of put everything on ice. There was no coming back. San Diego State was already going to be in need of, some kind of miracle. I think at that point they're down, 23 points with, about 2:40 to go. So I think you saw the defensive line just wear an offensive line down, and I think it goes to how many guys they are rotating in. They played 6 defensive ends. They played 6 defensive tackles. That at some point, when you've got the same offensive line out there for 62 plays, those guys get tired. Those are big bodies, and they get tired. And it's the same thing when you've got the Washington State. You want to play more offensive plays, right? But at the same time, there is that factor to it. And when the defense can rotate and is as deep as the Cougar defensive line is, that wears on a team to where, you only had 2 guys on the entire defensive line take 30-plus snaps, and that was Bryson Lamb and Bobby Terrell. Everyone else was between, you had Hughes at 7, Finau at 9, BD 11, Janikowski 14, Sanjo 15, Taase 15, Balloon 26, Dalton 28, Stevenson 28, Paletti 29. So there's a lot, and that's a lot different than last year when you would basically have, every single game, David Gusto was going to probably take, 55 to 60 snaps, and every single game you were going to see, Webster and so on. I mean, I'm just looking last year. Yeah, I mean, Gusta 45 snaps, Webster 40. So there were guys up in their 40, and this is a lot of 20 to 30.
Yes, and I think this is going to be a theme that might figure more prominently into how they do the rest of the season. Is like how consistent can they get this kind of production from their non-starters? I guess what I'm trying to say is how legit is this depth? I think if you, if Saturday's game was any indication, I think it could be really real. I mean, like you said, you have all these snaps spread out, you have so much depth. What I think we will find out this Saturday, which we'll get to when we go all in on North Texas talk, is do you get the same kind of depth when it's 93 degrees in Dallas, Texas? Can you rely on, or not necessarily rely, but can you get, a breather for Anthony Polano with Jack Ellison out there for 10 or 12 snaps? Can you get a breather for Tucker Large and put Deron Goodman or, like you said, Kyle Peterson out there and not feel like you're getting some kind of drop off? I think it's one thing to be able to trust that kind of depth, Saturday night at your place, you're kind of rolling already, middle of the game. When you're, like I said, on the road, it's hot as all heck in Texas, or even later down the line at Ole Miss or Virginia, or Jamey, whatever you might think about. Do you get the same kind of depth, and can you rely on those guys to the same extent that you did on Saturday? I think that's going to be kind of a bigger theme of their season, if you ask me.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, and I think it is a very fair question. As well as some of these guys played in their few snaps. Yeah, can you rely on Michael Hughes to within 7 snaps? Come up with 5 or 6 plays. Can you rely on Jack Ellison for 26 snaps? And those guys played extremely well against San Diego State. But yes, when you're on the road, whether it's North Texas or whether it's Ole Miss, can you rely on those guys to spell some of the starters? And I think they can at safety. I think you have enough faith between the trio: Durant's Large, Reeder, Goodman's a veteran, a JUCO guy. I think Peterson has earned that trust. I think same thing with Kenny Worthy at cornerback, but yes, it is the question. Can you get Polano a few snaps off? Do you have that faith and trust in Ellison to be able to do this on the road, new environment, etc.? Can you get Caleb Franzel a few snaps off? Can you get guys like Humphrey and Colson consistently, get them refreshers and play Worthy? I think that is the question. I think we'll get a good idea. But I do think that when it comes to the defensive line, and just in general, it just, there hasn't been that drop off. It's not been a situation where, okay, they had to go, they went to some of their backups and it got bad. Jack Ellison played 26 snaps. He was excellent. I mean, he had 4 tackles. He had 1 for loss. He had a hurry. He was their highest graded PFF player outside of Hughes when he played 7 snaps. You look at that and say, okay, are you expecting that every time he takes the field? Not necessarily, especially for a guy who this is really his first taste of college football. I mean, not a lot of second-year walk-ons get onto the field as much as he is right now through 2 games. But, I think when you look at that and that opportunity and just kind of the way he played, it's, okay, there's some confidence that he can be able to apply that and take that to the road, and that you can get Polano a few snaps off and maybe rotate the way you originally wanted to with Polano and Keith Brown. Obviously, that went out the window when Brown got hurt, but I think that was their hope that either Ellison or Sullivan Schlimgen would be ready to kind of play that rotational role. And based off what we've seen through 2 games, Ellison is. But yeah, no, I do think it'll be interesting to watch how that translates to an unfamiliar environment, to a road game. Everyone's yelling, everyone's against you in the crowd. It's going to be really hot down there in Denton. So I think it'll be a good test for the depth and to see just how deep they really are.
And not only that, but the style of offense that you're going to be going up against is not going to be giving you many chances for breathers either. So something to consider as well. Really quick, we have talked ad nauseum about their safeties, and rightfully so because they have been awesome and they have been as advertised. But I think we should talk a little bit about their cornerbacks too, because the job of a cornerback is similar to the job of a safety, where it is a very thankless job. When you play your best, you are not always going to be talked about because when you play your best, the ball's not coming to you. And I think we've seen a lot of that early on with Kobe Humphrey and Jamori Colson. There were a few plays during Saturday's game. I think it was on the same San Diego State drive where on one play, Kobe Humphrey, might be getting the order wrong, but on one play, Kobe Humphrey gets a PBU. Did he get there a little early? Maybe.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Well, it goes down as a PBU. So, and then either the play before or the play right after, Kenny Worthy makes an awesome play. Another PBU. This one there was no chance of that being a penalty. So, but just those plays in general, and then Jamori's been great too. I think there was a play early in the game where he's running stride for stride with an SDSU receiver, and it just the play's not going anywhere. So those types of plays do not get talked about very often, just because you look at the box score and there's no those don't show up the same way that catches or touchdowns do on offense. So those guys have played, I think, just as big a role in shutting down some of this passing attack through the first two games. I don't want to let their efforts go unnoticed because with a lot of these positions, the work is thankless. But not on this podcast. On this podcast, it is not thankless, and we will shout those guys out because I think they deserve it, and they've played a pretty invaluable role with how this season has gone so far for the Cougs.
I mean, they in 2 games they've allowed 166 passing yards.
It was 33.
33 against Idaho, 133 against San Diego State. The one passing touchdown they gave up came on a broken play, or on a play where Deron Goodman falls down. So I think you look at that, and then you look at last year when you gave up 294 passing yards to Ben Branson, who through 2 games at Stanford has 251 passing yards, 3 interceptions, and is completing 52% of his passes. I will forever not understand how they got torched that. I mean, I do understand how they got torched that badly. Their defense wasn't good last year, but I think you look at that, and and are Josh Wood and Jaden Denegal, Heisman finalists? No. I mean, I think Wood played well this last week against St. Thomas, but I think he by trade is more of a runner. Denegal wasn't good against Stony Brook either, at least accuracy wise. So I think you're not necessarily looking at 2 high-powered, big-arm quarterbacks. I think you're going to get a better test this week with Drew Mestamaker. But, either way, we saw this last year. Bad quarterbacks just tormented the Cougar secondary. I mean, we just talked about Branson. And, and you talk about some of the other guys that they just had absolutely no answer for. Not by any means that Emmett Brown was a bad quarterback, but he absolutely diced them up. And there was obviously a little bit of added flavor to that because he was a former Cougar. But, I think when you even start to look at what Mikey Keene did at Fresno State, you look at Danny O'Neill, really you kind of just go down the line up to the point where they give up a touchdown to a tight end playing quarterback. I mean, Evan Svoboda last year for Wyoming, who is literally now a tight end, doesn't have any stats yet this year.
I think he was a tight end before.
Oh, that might maybe.
So he just played quarterback because
no, but he's back at tight end now.
Right, but I'm saying that it's not like a new thing for him to be a tight end.
No, but he wasn't a quarterback, and he went 21 to 34 with a touchdown and a game-winning pass. So I think it's certainly positive to see the Cougar defense actually see I don't want to say bad quarterback, but a quarterback who struggles to throw the ball and actually be able to shut them down like they did with Denegal, like they did with Wood. I mean, you look at outside of the first drive, or not the first drive, the touchdown drive, the first touchdown drive, they have the 35-yard pass. Earlier that drive, they had a 16-yard pass. And then they had 2 other passing plays over 15 yards that came on the same drive in the third quarter. That was it. 4 passing plays over 15 yards. Legitimately last year, I guarantee you, there were drives where the Wazoo secondary gave up 4 passing plays of 15 yards. So you certainly have to be impressed, regardless of who the quarterbacks are, with how well the secondary has played. And that does absolutely go to the corners with Colson, with Humphrey, and with how well Kenny Worthy has really taken a step.
Folks, you are talking to the biggest Kenny Worthy fan in the world right here, and that's Jamey Vinnick. So No surprise.
Big Kenny Worthy fan.
He's a fun guy. We talked to him, I think, practice last week or the week before.
It was like 3 or 4 weeks ago now.
No. It was like 2 weeks ago.
Yes.
No, because that was when my Anthony Polano story came out, and that was like, oh, wait, you might be right, actually.
Hold on, I'm gonna figure out when I think I downloaded it on my previous computer because I don't have it here. So you're wrong.
All right. Well, obviously the timeline.
Hold on, we have to figure this out. Go ahead, though.
I was gonna say the grind of football season spares nobody, so our brains are getting turned to mush already. Well, he's gonna figure that out. Well, I guess we'll pause when he gets to that. But we do want to answer some of your questions, and we will save some of them for the North Texas segment, which will
August 19th.
That's when we talk to him.
That is when we talk to him. So that is.
All right.
4 weeks.
We can do the math. You know, don't have to worry about that.
21 days.
I'm just saying that.
But I digress.
Okay. Anyway, like I said, we do want to get to some of your questions, and I don't want to just like I think we'll spread them out as we get to each topic naturally. So while we're still talking about the San Diego State game, let's answer some questions about that one. The first one that I want to get to, or some of these can kind of lump together because they're kind of the same idea. Recurring listener Max Needs an Eighth in parentheses member says Jamey Vinnick appears to be correct about my last question. Life is worth living, and his new question is the O-line fixed? Offensive line took a big step forward.
I don't know if I would say it was broken to begin with. I mean, don't get me wrong, the run blocking was really poor against Idaho, but I think it was more there were some leaks than it was an absolutely broken experience. I think there was communication issues, and I think we saw a little bit more this week of what they're capable of and what you can kind of expect. I think they'll continue to get better. These guys are going to continue to familiarize themselves with one another. I thought Ashton Tripp week 1 to week 2 took a massive jump. I thought Johnny Lester played very well. I thought the whole line for the most part played well. There was only two TFLs this week, 3 TFLs for San Diego State.
They had 3.
3, okay, and one of them might have been a Potter quarterback sneak.
Oh yeah.
And not to mention, Trey White had 1.5 of them, and they might not see a better defensive end this year because there aren't many better in the country.
I don't think so either.
So I do think that the offensive line took some steps. And just for the other part of the question, yes, Jamey Vinnick was correct because he is always correct.
No shortage of confidence for Jamey today. I am glad that you brought up Trey White, who is, for those who don't know, one of San Diego State's, or for sure their best edge rusher. He's one of the best in the country. He had, I want to say, 12.5 sacks last year, which was 4th nationwide. So he is like truly a dude. And to be honest, like that was a big reason why I was having to think twice about who I wanted to pick to win the game in my preview story on Friday, was because like that's the kind of guy that can wreck an entire offensive game plan, especially against offensive lines like WSU's, which has 3 new members, many of whom have never played that many college snaps, and so you wonder like, hey, like is this the kind of guy that can change the complexion of an entire offense? And he certainly is capable of that. We've seen that time and again, but this was, I think, for them to shut him. I mean, I guess maybe not shut him down, but to severely limit his effectiveness in the way they did is one a credit, like you said, to Ashton Tripp. He did a great job, but also just like I think the offensive game plan to kind of like move away from him. I think they rolled out Jack Spotter to the right a lot, away from Trey White. I think they double teamed him sometimes. I think they just did it like, I don't know. I think they just did a good job of like kind of finding ways to play around him, and that was kind of what gave me confidence in their ability to avoid his effectiveness. Was just like the rest of their defensive line was not nearly as proven or as effective, and so for them to kind of scheme their way away from where he was, I think was a credit to Danny Freund, their OC, Taylor Lucas, their offensive line coach, because that is not easy. Because like I said, that is the kind of guy that can wreck an entire offensive game plan.
I mean, he had just to add to this, he had 2 pressures on 31 pass rushing snaps. You look at last year, he had 2 pressures against Texas A&M Commerce in a game they won by 1,000, so they weren't playing that much. And then he had 2 pressures. He had no pressures against New Mexico, and as we saw, a lot of that was probably just because of Devin Dampier. And then he had no pressures against Air Force because it's Air Force and they don't throw the ball. So every other game, He had a minimum of 3 pressures. He had 5 last week. He had 10 in a game against Hawaii last year. So to keep him to 2 pressures when you throw 42 times, and you pointed this out, Greg, during the game, that there was a sequence where I don't know if this was intentional or not. I kind of think it was because of how just, how the attention to detail of the coaching staff. But there was a sequence where White is off the field. So Wazoo says, okay, we're going no huddle. Don't let him get back on the field. And you pointed that out. And again, there are some coaches out there who I'd say, oh, that's a coincidence or something. I have a tough time believing it's a coincidence with how much these guys are just so attentive to the details where they probably notice, hey, White's out of the game. Let's keep moving.
Well, and they don't go tempo hardly ever anyway. So that was pretty noticeable. So yeah, I guess that's another shout out to the Cougs coaching staff and their attention to detail, because whenever you can keep that guy out of the game, you have to try and capitalize on that. So and then I think as far as the offensive line goes, I think there were just a lot fewer plays where they're blocking nobody. We talked a lot about that after the Idaho game, where there's multiple occurrences where Christian Holborn is just blocking nobody. They're just missing assignments, not blocking the right guys, and so that allowed a lot of the Vandals to get into the backfield. But that was not nearly as much of a thing against San Diego State. So I think it's a product of playing your first game, getting your first game out of the way, and then now you're like, okay, like now we know who we're blocking, and maybe a little bit of Trey White, like, hey, we really got to lock in for a guy like that. So I think that's I don't know if they're fixed. I mean, they're not going to be perfect, but I think that was a giant step forward, and we would expect nothing less from a group of 2 veterans like Christian Holborn and Brock Dew. Okay. Let's see. Our next question. Let's see. Oh, here's one. Okay, so we have one from, hope I'm saying your name right, Avbaden, whose is the same, says, I'd like to know what the Cougars can do to avoid so many 3-and-outs. The defense can't hold forever. The final stats were very deceiving at the end of the game. The offense struggled horrifically much of the game. Is it just getting behind the chains on bad first down plays?
Well, so what you can do to avoid 3-and-outs is get first downs.
What a concept!
No, but I think it's certainly something that has been a problem early on through 2 games. There have been a lot of 3-and-outs. There's been a lot of scenarios where and I think if you look at this last game, the penalties killed them. I mean, they had 3 drives that were destroyed by holding calls. 2 on Adamola Falei, 1 on AJ Vaipulu. So I think that's part of it. I think part of what killed them with 3-and-outs against Idaho was the first down runs that would lose 2 yards. So I do think, again, 5 of 18 isn't good enough. That is playing with fire on third down. And especially what I think was crazy in the Idaho game was it was 3rd and 1 and 3rd and 2 and 3rd and 3, and just it was the runs up the middle that were not working. But then you look at kind of the opposite. All right, 3rd and 11, 3rd and 16, 3rd and 13, 3rd and 18, 3rd and 14. That was a kneel down. That doesn't count. But it was you put yourself again behind the sticks a lot. But then even then, 3rd and 1, they do the sneak with Potter. It doesn't work. 3rd and 3, they throw to Voorhees. It doesn't work. So when they were, I'm just looking at this right now. When they were 3rd and 5 or less, they in the first quarter. Or first, I think it was maybe the first half, they missed 3 opportunities. Then when you got into the second half, they were a lot more consistent with that. So I think some of it's better third down play calling, but also some of it is don't get yourself behind the chains so much. And then when you do get ahead, when you're 3rd and 2, maybe something more deceptive than trying to pound Kirby Voorhees up the middle. Sometimes that does work. It was a huge 4th down play for him, but that also is something the defense is going to key on.
What were the other distances that they had on 3rd down again? Do you have that in front of you?
Yes, I do. So they had 3rd and 9, didn't work. 3, didn't work. 1, didn't work. 6, worked. 3, didn't work. 8, didn't work. 11, didn't work. 6, didn't work. Okay, that was the Meredith fumble play, but they didn't get the first down on it. 1, worked. 18, didn't work. 9, didn't work. 13, didn't work. 16, didn't work. 6 worked, 2 worked, 8 didn't work, 3 worked for a touchdown, and then 14 was the kneel down at the end of the game.
Right. Okay. Well, what obviously 3rd and medium and 3rd and long are just harder in general. But what I noticed about those distances on 3rd downs was that when you get in the obvious passing situations, it becomes a lot harder to keep Trey White out of from generating pressure when he knows he can pin his ears back and just go after the quarterback. So I think part of that is just you have these play calls on maybe first or second down that don't work out, and we can debate the decision making on some of those types of downs, but it is what it is. And when you end up in a situation where it's pretty obvious you're going to be passing, you don't sometimes, and this does not have to be an indictment on this specific offensive line. This goes for many, many, many offensive lines around the country, is that it is significantly harder to just, keep guys out of the backfield, keep guys from getting to the quarterback when your edge rushers, especially when you have a guy like Trey White out there, know that they're going to be passing and they can just go full bore and go after the quarterback. So I think the key to that is just having, a little bit of smarter play calls, getting more creative on first and second down so you don't end up in situations like that. And I think part of it, I can't believe I went this long without getting this stat in here, which I've tweeted out a couple times. I asked Jimmy Rogers about this on Monday. So Jimmy Rogers has coached now 32 games as a head coach, first 2 years at South Dakota State and now these 2 here at WSU. Never has a quarterback thrown for as many passes as Jackson Potter did on Saturday. He threw 42, which is, I think, by a margin of 5, the most by a quarterback in a game that Rogers has coached as a head coach, which is pretty significant, especially when you consider just like the run-first mentality that he and his staff has, which I think will work out in the end. But I think the more significant development that this shows is how willing they are to make adjustments and how quickly they recognize the importance of doing that. I think especially, and this is more so on defense, under the last staff the last couple of years, but they were tremendously slow to make adjustments, at least on defense last year. And with this new coaching staff, and it's early, it's a whole different side of the ball, whole new, scene. But I think this speaks to just a really strong willingness to make adjustments. Like I said, you recognize them quicker, and this is like kind of a whole different philosophy that they're opening themselves up to in the course of a game, which is no easy task. Especially like I said, when you have a staff that wants to run the ball as much as they do. So I think this just highlights one, their willingness to make adjustments, 2, the trust they have in Jackson Potter, which I don't think they showed as much of in week 1, but week 2 they let him rip it, and when he is allowed to, when they have him do that, I think he has looked awesome. Now will they throw 42 passes consistently? I would be surprised, but Jamey, I think at the very least, it shows that they're willing to, 1, trust the quarterback, and 2, make those kinds of adjustments.
Yeah, I mean, I think it drove people nuts last year when Washington State would insist, no, we have to run the ball. We have to run the ball. We have to run the ball. And then they would do it to a fault. Or they would run the ball and then decide to stop. It was what plagued so many of the third quarters is they would come out of the half with just a baffling offensive game plan. And, I think it's fair to look at that and say, okay, was that Ben Arbuckle's doing or was Jake Dickert meddling? But for whatever it was, it was really funky at times. And I think, to a fault last year, that staff was loyal and just firmly determined that they were going to run their scheme and they were convinced it was going to work. I mean, that's why 4th and 1, you'd have linebackers 8 yards off the line. That's why you're running a Tampa 2 scheme with a weak pass rush and poor safety play. So now you look at the way that, we joke about the word multiple and how much coaches use it nowadays, but they are very multiple in what they do with their defensive schemes. And, there were scenarios this past week where Large was in the game, Durant was in the game, and either Goodman or Peterson was in the game. So they basically cycle Tucker Large down to nickel, and you still have the 3 safeties. So I think you look at the defensive side, they're willing to adjust, but then also the offense. You're absolutely right. This is a team and a coaching staff who by trade has been a run-focused team. That's what Jimmy Rogers wants to do, now not to the point of where you're not throwing it, but what he said, I care about winning. You said, are you okay with that? I'm okay with winning. And Rogers recognized that, as much as he maybe wants to run the ball right now, the team's strength might be in throwing the ball. And if you're going to name Jackson Potter the quarterback, and sacrifice some of the mobility that like a Duggar would have, for example. You need to let him kind of cut loose and throw. And I think we've seen now through 2 weeks, when they really do that, it's effective. And the run game, I think, opened up a lot more because San Diego State had to respect the pass.
The pass that Jackson Potter threw to Leon Neal for a touchdown, I don't think he could have thrown that pass any better. I think that was in the perfect spot. And shout out to Leon Neal too. We have joked a little bit in the past just about how much he's appeared to be on the cusp of getting into the rotation, but it has never really panned out that way. Now he gets his first touchdown catch. Former walk-on, got put on scholarship this spring. So big shout out to Leon Neal. Long time coming for him.
He was one of the what we would joke about with the Jake Dickert All-Stars. Dickert had so many guys that he would talk about, praise, and that's fine as a coach, but he'd always go too far, or almost too far, to say, so many guys were going to make an impact, and then so many guys just were, on the sidelines. He'd stick with the same guys, and I think, I think I mentioned this before before week one. Jimmy Rogers has talked up a lot of guys this year, but the guys he talks up then play. He talks up Trillian Sorrell and Sullivan Schlingen before fall camp, and they're both playing roles on special teams. He in the spring did not have enough good things to say about Leon Neal. And here's Leon Neal playing a role as a rotational receiver and getting his first touchdown. So I think, it was awesome for Leon. I know, 5 years anywhere nowadays is rare. 5 years when you're the first 4, you're a walk-on, and you've basically played 4 different positions, and you've got 3 coaching staffs and a bunch of different teammates, to kind of stick it out. I think says a lot about him and a lot about his loyalty, and he's the type of guy that I think the program wants to model after, where, guys like him, Meredith, not even so much the Hillborns and the Dews, just because they played pretty early, but guys like Meredith and Neal, who took forever to get onto the field, but are now kind of reaping the rewards of their patience.
This next question is a perfect segue, or not even a segue, but more just on topic with what we're talking about now. It comes from Casey Ferguson, who asks, can you talk about the similarities and differences between Rogers and Dickert as both coaches and leaders of the program? It appears as if we are more sound in assignments and technique, especially on defense. Sans mental errors. Is this practice habits, messaging, or what?
I mean, I think the biggest difference is obviously the personalities. I think Jimmy Rogers cares about winning games. That's it. And if the media doesn't like him, or if fans don't like it, I mean, I think I shouldn't say that. He wants to be, I think, well regarded by the fan base, but he's not here to make buddy with like the media, for example. That doesn't, and I'm not saying that he's not, very cordial and polite and good to work with and all that. He's, very, very insightful, very easy guy to talk to in that way, but it's a lot different. Jake Dickert always had his jokes and his kind of big personality, and I'd say it this way. If Jimmy Rogers didn't have to do a weekly presser, I don't think he would. If Jake Dickert didn't have to do a weekly presser, he would insist that he does. Dickert wanted the camera on him. He wanted the publicity. He wanted, everyone to see him and know him, and he wanted to be a public figure. And I think Rogers obviously wants to be involved in the community, wants to be involved with the school and all these things, but I also think he is perfectly happy doing that under the radar and, going about his business as a football coach. And I think you see that, we talked about the difference in, their post-game pressers. Rogers was pretty clearly unhappy versus Idaho. Dickert stops us a couple years ago when they beat Idaho and says, guys, we won the game. And then even this past week, it's a 23-point win. And Rogers is still not satisfied. He is still talking about what they didn't do well, what they need to get better at. You can just tell there's no satisfaction when it comes to winning the game. It's a product of a guy who's, done nothing but win through 27-3, 28-3, whatever it is now. And then just, in the technique, I think it's just there's better defensive coaches. I think Jimmy Rogers is, plain and simple, a better defensive mind than Jake Dickert. I think Jesse Bobbitt is a better defensive mind than Jake Dickert. And they come off the John Stiegelmeier coaching tree, who was a better defensive mind than a lot of coaches, not just Jake Dickert. But I think you see that in the technique. I think you see that in the scheme. And we were just talking about, I think you see that in the willingness to, hey, this team needs 2 yards. We're going to stack the box and not leave our linebackers 8 yards off the line. Hey, this area on our defense is a weakness. We're not going to build a scheme that requires that to be our top position. So I think, and maybe the practice habits, is there something to be said that after so many practices in fall camp, Dickert would always do the games, the water balloon tosses, the inflatable jousting, whereas that was not Rodgers' style. Does that matter? It's tough to say, but I think the messaging, I think it gets across. I think you see the videos on social media. Rodgers is still enjoying himself after the game. He's still dancing and singing with the players, but he also then goes and he's business. And I think the messaging, and we'll see how it goes throughout the season, but I think the messaging is what's going to maybe stand out as difference. I think the Dickert rah-rah got old, and that's why you saw him kind of lose locker rooms towards the end of the season. Guys would check out because it was the same thing. He had his talking points. Every game, I got outcoached. Or every game that they lost or won close, I got outcoached. I got outcoached. I got outcoached. Rodgers has said, that's on me. I got to be better. But, there comes a time where you saying you got outcoached gets old, and your players are probably sick of hearing it and from what we've maybe even heard from guys like Isaac Terrell and kind of his candid comments, was that what he was saying in the locker room? Was he saying I got outcoached, or was it a different message? We've heard a lot of the players that stayed here allude to some of the differences, whether it's Terrell or Lamb or Meredith, or even Leighton Smithson, about how it's a bit different of a messaging, and it's all as when it comes to Rodgers, what you see is what you get. Whereas I think there was a lot of differences with Dickert to us versus what he was with the players.
I don't want to speak for Isaac Terrell at all. He is a grown man and can do that. But I think when you put two and two together, I think he is a big fan of the new coaching staff and not so much of the previous coaching staff. Because like you just mentioned, we talked to him last week. That was when I know was last week, not 3 weeks ago.
Correct.
But we talked to him last week after practice, and the comment that stood out most to us was Sam Taylor of the Lewiston Tribune asked him about his experience in his first game under the new coaching staff. And the first words out of his mouth were, when you come off the sideline, you don't get reamed. You get built back up. They tell you what you did wrong, but then they build you back up and send you back out there. And he felt like that gives him a lot of confidence to play his best instead of getting torn down, which is what he felt like was happening under the previous coaching staff.
And just kind of to finish that point, I mean, do with this what you will, but when there's a coaching change, you tend to bring a lot of guys, recruits, some of the guys off your roster, etc. There were 4 guys that went to Wake with Dickert, excluding redshirt freshmen and excluding signees. You, again, do with that what you will. There were 16 guys that came from South Dakota State, excluding the signees. And I think it's still, if you take out like Polano and Reynolds and Laquona and Backen, it's still 12 guys. The best players, for the most part, from South Dakota State, with the exception of Bryce Hawthorne, Mark Gronowski, and Griffin Wilde, came with Jimmy Rodgers. The best players from Washington State did not go with Jake Dickert. And it was a step up, group of 5 to power 5. But, and in fairness, a lot of those guys had already hit the portal. But the best players, whether it's Mateer or O'Connor or Al Ukta or Gusta, I mean, that was, I think, the surprising one, considering how loyal he was to Pete Calligas. They didn't go to Wake Forest. They either transferred, or in some cases, when you look at Dew and Hilborn, they stayed at Washington State.
To be fair with Gusta, we talked about this a lot. From what I think both of us have heard, he got a giant payday from UK, which he deserves. I'm not trying to say that was out of order, but I think that was definitely part of it. But yeah, you're totally onto something there. I don't want to run cover for Jake Dickert, because I think obviously he had his flaws on the field. But what I think, and this is neither here nor there, but just so I can say this piece, even though the end of his tenure ended the way it did, obviously he made a huge mistake with the way he exited, with his first post being on the PJ to North Carolina to go to Wake Forest. I think he handled that the wrong way, and that should not be discounted at all. But I think when WSU was going through what it went through in August of 23, he was who they needed at that time.
Completely agree. He was a great face for the program to put out there that was going to speak to, candidly, he was going to defend the university. And the thing is he was great for us to deal with. And I'll never say otherwise on that. But I think when you start to hear what's come out and you combine that with how the season started to unfold, and then, as you said, just the really poor taste exit and just the way he did things. And then I've said before, the comments he made about the recruiting territories near Washington. I mean, that was the one that really rubbed me the wrong way of, you got California and you made it a priority to recruit these territories. I mean, that to me was just a baffling thing to say. Not to mention, he had a lot of players that you don't think he wanted to bring Christian Hilborn while running down his home state? So I think that was the exit is what really rubbed me the wrong way of, it became clear that a lot of what he said about loyalty and dedication and we want people who want to be here and all that, he jumped at the first opportunity to go to a Power 4 school. If it had been Wisconsin or some Big Ten or SEC school, fine, but call a spade a spade. Is Wake Forest and the ACC a step up from what the new Pac-12 is going to be? Theoretically, yes. It is the very bottom of the barrel of Power 4 schools. He wanted that. He wanted the Power 4 opportunity. And yes, I understand there was also the Kirk Schultz factor. He didn't feel like he was going to get the financial support, but the minute a Power 4 opportunity came up, he jumped, and I think that rubbed people very much the wrong way for someone who screamed about loyalty for so long.
Well, and this is what we've talked about. Well, now we're just rambling, but this is what we talked about before, is that this is the risk you take when you preach what he preached. When you spend so much time talking about, like you said, we want people who want to be here. We want people who are invested in WSU. We want people that are loyal. We want X, Y, and Z. That is all great to say, and I think there's nothing wrong with that sentiment, obviously. Like, he was onto something. But the reality is, I don't think anybody expected him to be the coach at WSU for his entire life.
No, not at all.
So what you get in where the risk you run in expressing that in such a strong way is that even if he had left in a much more gracious and like ceremonial way, you end up looking a certain way when you take a different job. Obviously, the situation matters. And I think, like you said, if he had gone to Wisconsin or some other, clear-cut step forward, I don't think he would have looked as bad. But that is, like you said, that is the risk you run when you preach loyalty and people who want to be here and that kind of thing. Because the reality is, as much as he didn't like, I'm sure he was, disappointed in, for example, John Mateer hitting the portal or any number of guys choosing to leave early. Coaches do the same thing. And neither is right or wrong. It's a case-by-case thing, but, coaches do the same thing.
You can't say, why wouldn't you finish the season before the bowl game and then leave before the bowl game? And I think it came out, he did an interview with John Canzano and talking about how he hoped Washington State fans would appreciate what they'd done. And I think that was another thing was like, what'd they do? Yeah. You look at the reaction to Jake Dickert leaving and look at the reaction to Kyle Smith. And that tells you what you need to know because Kyle Smith did something that very few coaches have ever done. He left for what had always been his dream job and for his family. Jake Dickert was the first coach to miss the bowl game after an 8-year streak and took what should have probably been a 10 or 11 win team and finished 8-4 last year before the bowl game. I think there's a line of where Washington State fans are. Yeah, like you said, they're happy. Thanks for being kind of in front of all this when it was all going down. But at the same time, he didn't accomplish anything that other Cougar coaches hadn't. He didn't accomplish something that Mike Leach didn't do or that Mike Price didn't do. It's like, okay, you won 7 games one year, you won 8 games one year, you got to a bowl game. Congratulations. But I think you said the way it went down of the loyalty preaching to suddenly bolt, it's, he said all the right things. He hit the right talking points for a fan base that wanted to hear exactly what he had to say in that regard. But then it comes off very hollow and very fake.
Without a doubt. All right. That is our Jake Dickert spiel. Now we're going to move on to a little bit of previewing the North Texas game this Saturday. So coming up on Saturday, WSU will be playing in what figures to be by far the hottest environment of the season. Like I mentioned at the beginning, game temperatures are going to be around the mid-90s, around 2:30 p.m. local time, which is when this game is going to be kicking off. And like I also mentioned, you add a few ticks to that temperature when you are surrounded by turf, playing on that turf. So it's going to be close to 100 degrees, at least at the beginning of the game on Saturday. So that, those are tough conditions to start out with. And then you get into the opponent that they're playing, which is North Texas, coached by former WSU OC Eric Morris, who had that job in 2022. And he runs one of the nation's fastest offenses. I believe they're 21.2 seconds per play, which makes them, I want to say, the fifth fastest offense in the country. Their quarterback is Drew Mestemaker, who, in a surprise development, was named the starting quarterback over a competitor whose first name is Reese, and the last name that I'm going to draw a blank on.
Offenbarger.
Right there. He was, the favorite, I guess, going into the competition, but he ends up not winning the job. It is Drew Mestemaker on the season, 42-65 through the air, which is 65%, 553 yards, 5 touchdowns. More of a pocket passer, but is not afraid to run either. 54 rushing yards and 1 rushing touchdown on the season. So what gets the headlines with the Mean Green is their offense and just the blistering pace that they play with, the playmakers they have at the skill positions. Jamey, what are your initial impressions of North Texas, and what does Wazoo have to do to get it done on Saturday?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of what Cougar fans saw for so many years with Mike Leach. Is it that level of air raid? No, nothing's that level of air raid anymore. There's not going to be another offense, I don't think, that will be as pure pass as Leach's was. But Eric Morris is off the tree. So there's a lot of the same concepts, a lot of the mesh, a lot of the 4 verticals, a lot of, getting the running backs involved in the passing game to some degree. But there's also the presence of a running game with Mackenzie McGill. And actually, I mentioned, he getting the running backs involved in the passing game. They only have 3 receptions by running backs, 2 from Kiefer Sibley, 1 from Caleb Hawkins. They also use tight ends, which Leach never did. But it's a lot of kind of the quarterback who maybe isn't the most mobile in the world. Can he move? Yes. He can get outside the pocket. And maybe isn't going to have all the 70 and 80-yard big plays, but is going to be consistent. He's going to be accurate. Decision-making is obviously key. So I think when you look at that with Mestemaker, it stands out. Again, no interceptions this year. 3 sacks. Those came last week. So, can you get home? I think that's probably the hope, is that the Cougars can generate something of a pass rush. But I think when it stands out, it's kind of the new air raid per se, and very similar to what Washington State fans saw in 2022. I think the question Cougar fans will have is, will there be just the incessant bubble screens that there were in 22, or, as not to link it again back to Dickert, or was that a product of what he wanted to do, is just run those bubble screens / they had a very poor offensive line that year?
What has been one of the great joys of my life is finding out some Cougar lore from years before I got here, and the bubble screens certainly applies to that. Before I go any further, you were making yourself out to be someone who was never wrong. You said that Mestemaker does not have the 70-yard runs. He had a 70-yard touchdown run in their bowl game last year.
70-yard passes is what I said.
Is that what you said?
Mm-hmm. I said he's not going to have the 70, 75-yard passes, because that's not how necessarily the air raid offense always works. It can, but a lot of it is more the mesh concepts and just chunks and chunks and chunks.
All right, well, in some way, he is a big playmaker in other ways. There will be a day, and I will keep that in mind. But what I do, anyway, I was joking about learning some Cougar lore with the bubble screens. So on PFF, which we both love PFF, you can go and check out the distances that quarterbacks are throwing to and their accuracy at those distances. And these bubble screens are often run, obviously, at the line of scrimmage or behind them. And so far, Drew Mestemaker has not been throwing many of those. He did throw a pick on a bubble screen in the bowl game, which was last year. But so far, he has not been throwing many of those this season. He has thrown some screen passes in the middle of the field, but those, to me, look like more just, traditional halfback slips out for a screen pass. The bubble screens do not seem to be as en vogue with this UNT offense as maybe it was with the Cougs in 2022. But what you do get is super fast-paced offense. What I do want to get into is I think this could be a chance for the Cougs defensive line and defensive ends to wreak havoc, I think, in the way that we expected Trey White to last weekend. Last week, UNT's offensive line gave up 4 sacks against Western Michigan. Like I said, they are 2-0. They beat Western Michigan on the road in overtime last weekend. So in that game, the offensive line was responsible for giving up 4 sacks, and that came on 12 total pressures, which is a pretty high number. And I think when you combine that with the game that the Cougars pass rush is coming off of, I think this is a real chance for them to keep that going. I mean, I think you'll get Isaac Terrell, who we touched on earlier. This could be a chance for him to keep things rolling and really, I think break out. I think that's been the thing that he's been waiting on for his entire career so far. Is 23, he we've talked about gets a chance at a red shirt wasted for only a few more snaps and one extra game, and then last year he has a role but nothing really too consistent or meaningful. But this year, I mean, he is making a real difference this year, and I think when you look at this game and some of the weaknesses that UNT has, at least up front on their offensive line, Jamey, I think this is a chance for them to really get after the quarterback, and I think you have to do that to disrupt the offense that they run.
Absolutely. I mean, you mentioned it. Western Michigan was able to get 4 sacks, 12 pressures. Theoretically, you would probably think Washington State has a better front or defensive line than Western Michigan. That's not a knock on them, but I think Western Michigan has a defensive tackle named August Johannigsmeyer. That's the greatest name I've ever heard. But I digress. I do think there is an opportunity, though, for Terrell, for Buda Paletti, for Ram Stevenson to get home and to make an impact in the pass rush. And I think that's kind of how you have to beat Mestemaker. And that's just any air raid quarterback. You let him sit back there and deliver, they're tough to beat. I mean, that's what made the Leach offense so effective at Washington State, is they had just these monster offensive lines with NFL players, unanimous All-Americans. And when they started to struggle, when the games that they would struggle, in the Apple Cups, for example, it was because pressure would start to come. And the guys like Luke Falk and Anthony Gordon and Connor Halliday couldn't really move outside the pocket. I think Mestemaker's certainly more mobile than those guys are. But, he's still an air raid quarterback by trade, is not going to be a guy who really wants to run the way like a John Mateer did. He was not your natural air raid quarterback. And I don't think it's fair to call really what they were doing the last couple of years a true air raid. It was the Coug raid, what Dickert called it. So I think, you flush Mestemaker, you make him make plays with his legs. Eventually, he's going to start to wear down that way. You throw a few hits on him. Any quarterback, they don't like getting hit. So you hit him a few times. I think he's a guy, especially, this is a guy who never started the game in high school. He didn't start a game until the bowl game last year. So he is still very green in his experience. If you
no
can
pun intended.
Quite good. If you can get pressure on him, I think you've got a chance to rattle him. And I think even to some degree, Eric Moore said today that Mestemaker got a little bit rattled against Western Michigan. Now, this is a home game, but this is also likely a much more ferocious defensive line.
For sure. And I think this is also a chance for Caleb Ransel to utilize his greatest tool, which is his speed. Like you said, I don't think he's going to, I don't think Mestemaker is going to be looking to run the way Joshua Wood was, for example, in week 1. But I think if you feel that threat is credible enough, then that's when you use a little bit of Caleb Ransel to spy on him and make sure he doesn't make those kinds of plays with his legs. But that also, in the same breath, that is also a strength that he can use, that Ransel can use in pass coverage. I mean, we saw, multiple times last Saturday, was like he was lining up in coverage on some of the SDSU receivers. So he's obviously a linebacker, so that's not his forte. But that speed, can benefit you in all manner of ways. And obviously, especially against a quarterback that you feel can hurt you with his legs as well. Not to go under the radar is UNT running back Mackenzie McGill, who bounced back from a slow game against Lamar. That was their first game, a 51-0 win, no less. But in that game, he had 1 rushing yard on 6 carries. A week later, 102 yards on 16 carries, including a long rush of 16 yards. So kind of a smaller back. He's listed at 5'9" and 202 pounds, so maybe more of a power back in that way. But certainly a guy to look out for, a guy that they need to bring down. That was another improvement that I thought that the Coug defense made from week 1 to week 2, which is, I know that the whole missed tackles thing can be a little misleading just because of the way they routed the ball, which I think was amazing in week 2. But they did go from 16 missed tackles in week 1. This is Wazoo's defense. 16 missed tackles in week 1 to just 8 in week 2 against San Diego State. And you factor in kind of, what profiles as a step up in competition against SDSU, and that was a pretty meaningful improvement that they made, I think. So that's going to be key, I think, against guys like Messmaker and McGill, is just when you get your chance to bring them down, whether it's for a sack or, in the open field with McGill, you got to do it, because you cannot give an air raid like this any chances to beat you when you have them wrapped up. The receivers, the top two targets are Wyatt Young and Cameron Dorner, the latter of whom actually transferred up from a Division II to UNT this year. So that's pretty remarkable. But those two have combined for 16 catches for, so quick math here, 258 yards. I'm not totally useless at math, as you may be led to believe based on the fact that I went to school for journalism. But then also 4 combined touchdowns for those two as well. So that's kind of the personnel of their offense. And I think when you take it all together, what you get is a pretty potent offense, a fast-paced offense, and this is going to be a pretty big test for, like you mentioned earlier, the depth of what we have noticed and what we think is a pretty deep defensive group for the Cougs. But I think this is going to be obviously their first real test, but you combine the conditions, the personnel, and all of that, and this is going to be a pretty big test for them, obviously, Jamey.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think you kind of hit the nail on the head. I think you kind of summarized it pretty well.
Let's go to some of the questions that we have about UNT. And the first one that I think we should get to, because it's starting to, I think this is going to become a bigger factor as the season goes on, is the absence of Devin Ellison, who has been out for the first 2 games with what Jimmy Rogers has called a heel contusion. Was in a boot before the game against Idaho, was out of the boot before week 2 against San Diego State. But so far, they've been able to manage this loss, obviously score 36 points, and you feel like you have cushioned the loss of your receiver in Ellison. But I think it's going to impact them at some point. And I think when you look at the conditions that they're playing in on Saturday, I think it's going to play a factor. I mean, like, his biggest thing, obviously, is just the vertical threat. It's a big reason why they selected Jackson Potter as the starting quarterback, with just his ability to take the top off with his deep ball, which I think is by far the best out of the 4 quarterbacks that ran on that competition. So you lose the guy that you feel most comfortable sending on these deep threats, catch passes from your quarterback, who you, in part, selected because of his deep ball. And that's going to, I think it's going to become a factor. So I think just the absence of a vertical guy hampers an offense. Obviously, in theory, it hasn't yet. But I think at some point that's going to make an impact, whether it's this Saturday or the ones to come. That's going to be become a thing. People are wondering why they're an underdog. They are Wazoo listed, at least yesterday. I haven't looked today, but they were a 5-point underdog on Monday. Jamey, I think this is a combination of, one, you're on the road, you take a hit because of just playing on the road, which goes for many teams, unless you're, Texas or Penn State. But also just, you're going up against a pretty potent offense on the road, brand new team on offense, that kind of thing. Is that making kind of sense to you? Do you feel like they should be underdogs, Jamey?
I think I think it's probably one of those games, neutral site, it's a pick 'em. So the home team's favored. I think it's as simple as that. I think if this game was in Pullman, I think Washington State would be favored. So I don't think there's any deep, underlying, crazy, like what's going on here kind of deal. It's I think as simple as North Texas is at home. Washington State has to travel. The end result is the home team is favored.
For sure, yeah. I don't think it actually has to be that complicated. And that's no shot at North Texas. I mean, like I said, we talked about how potent their offense is and the good things they have going for them. but I think that is probably the single biggest factor is just the venue that they're playing at. So I think that's the answer there. Well, I believe we have gotten to maybe not all the questions, but most of the topics. The one question I'm looking at right here is from Be Specific 2, who asks, "Can the Cougars get to Ole Miss week undefeated?" And that would be for them. That would be, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, week 6, or I guess week 7 with the bye week. So you're looking at 6-0 going to Ole Miss.
Not impossible.
It's not impossible. I would be surprised, honestly, just because of you're on the road twice and in that span. You have the Apple Cup. For me, I would be surprised, not because I think they're a bad team or anything, but that's just like there's only so many undefeated teams in week 7 of the season.
I wouldn't be floored, like just dumbfounded, but I do think I mean you still have 2 road games. You've got the Apple Cup against Washington, like. To win those 3 games in succession, again, could it happen? Absolutely. It's not like, we're saying in there, oh, they've got to beat Georgia or they got to beat Texas. They got to beat 2 group of 5 teams on the road, and they've got to beat 1 Big Ten team at home that hasn't won a road game in 2 years. / their head coach has 6 true road wins / rivalry game. You never know. So I do think I think it's possible. I think it's not some. It wouldn't necessarily take a miracle. But I think I would still lean towards unlikely right now just because of how the schedule kind of shapes up.
Without a doubt, I'm not discounting it altogether. I think just because of all the factors that Jamey listed off, I think for both of us, it would be a pretty surprising development. Well, I think with that, we have, like I said, we have now gotten to all the topics that were presented to us. Thank you guys again for sending these along. I've been pleasantly surprised just at the reception to the podcast. We really appreciate you guys tuning in, all the questions. Keep sending those along. I will send out a weekly call for those. And we really appreciate you guys sending those in and checking out the podcast. And I think with that, we're going to wrap this one up. Again, apologies for getting this out a day later. Usually this will be a Monday thing, but I think this also gave us a chance to get a little more into the upcoming opponent. Which we didn't really do either of the last 2 episodes. So we will do more of that moving forward. But for episode 3, I think this is going to do it. Thank you guys for tuning in as always, and we will see you guys next week.